My name is Alan Keele. I'm an emeritus professor of German studies at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. I live in Orem, Utah, which is a neighboring city. And as you know from the word emeritus, that means I'm retired now. But when I was a brand new professor in 1971, I just had received my PhD from Princeton University and had begun to teach at BYU. I took an interest in the works of the German novelist Günter Grass, who later was to win the Nobel Prize. And it was generally conceded that Günter Grass was the man who put German literature back on the map after 1945. In 1959, he published a book called The Tin Drum, Die Blechtrommel. And it was a sensation, and things weren't the same after that. And so I got interested in Grass's works, and I'd begun to read them all. I actually did my dissertation on the man named Paul Schalück, who had encouraged Grass to write the Tin Drum. He was a member of the Gruppe 47. That's neither here nor there. So I had begun to read my way through the vast novels of Günter Grass. And when I got to 1969, he'd written 10 years after the Tin Drum, he'd written another smaller novel called Örtlich betäubt, which means local anesthetic. And it had to do with the turmoil of the 1968 riots and other problems in Europe, and especially in Germany. And he has a protagonist in the novel, a young man named Philipp Scherbaum, who is a very popular and very talented young high school student, but he doesn't know how to properly protest against the war in Vietnam. First, he thinks he'll burn himself. He'll dump gasoline on himself and light a match and go up in flames, because that was actually happening quite a bit during the Vietnam era. If you Google self-immolations during Vietnam, you will be surprised how many there were. Some quite famous ones, including a young man named Jan, something or other, I forgot his last name, in Prague. But his teacher in school is horrified by this, and he decides to try to convince young Scherbaum not to kill himself. So Scherbaum says, well, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to kill myself, because Germans wouldn't care if I killed myself. They've seen all kinds of people burn up. But if I burn my dog, that would mess them up. Here you see Günter Grass's strange sense of humor. But it's true that in Berlin, they would be very upset if you burned your dog. But before he gets the chance to even burn his long-haired dachshund, Max, the teacher finds out that he's found a different idea. And he discovered this idea when he discovered an article in a newspaper about Helmuth Hübener, a young Mormon kid who was 16 years old, who fought against the Nazis in a nonviolent, intelligent action that involved teaching people the truth, that it involved writing things. So Grass, as a writer, was very interested in this young man who had decided to write to oppose the Nazis. And young Philipp Scherbaum, who discovers this model, this exemplar, as it were, somebody he could emulate, he also decides to be a writer. He's the most talented kid in the school, but he'd always said, no, I don't want to be the editor of the school paper. But now he becomes the editor of the school paper. And the first article he writes is about Helmuth Hübener and Kurt Georg Kiesinger in the year 1942. Kiesinger was the chancellor of Germany and had a Nazi past. So I was surprised as a Mormon, lifelong Mormon. I said, wow, I've never heard of him. So I started to do some research, and it turned out that the article that Grass had read in a newspaper had been written by a young man named Ulrich Zander in Hamburg, who after the war was given an assignment in the gymnasium to write a school essay on some aspect of the German resistance to Hitler in Hamburg. And he somehow stumbled onto the Helmuth Hübener story, and he did some research, talked to people who had known Hübener, and one thing led to another, and he wrote a school essay. He was very proud of it, and he got it published in this obscure newspaper called Die Deutsche Post. Günter Grass, very oddly, happened to be a subscriber to this obscure newspaper. And so that's how the link started up. When I got a hold of his original article, then I noticed the names of other people who were involved in the Hübener story. Hübener had two stepbrothers, for example, Hans and Gerhard Kunkel. And he had two co-conspirators, his friends, fellow teenagers in the LDS branch in Hamburg called the St. Georg branch. One was named Karl Schnibbe and the other was Rudi Wobbe. And so I got the idea to look in the Salt Lake City phone book. And lo and behold, I found a lot of people who had emigrated from Germany after the war to Salt Lake City who were involved in this story. So I was sitting on a wonderful research opportunity as I saw it. So I began to do the research. I phoned Karl Schnibbe and he said, I've been waiting for 30 years for this call. This was in 1971. And I met Karl. He was a wonderful guy, he had a marvelous memory. Rudi Wobbe was likewise a wonderful person. Rudi, unfortunately, had contracted cancer, and before very long, he passed away. But I encouraged Rudi to write his story before it was too late. And he wrote a story and had a friend of his in the ward help him publish it. And it's now still in print. And it's called 3 Against Hitler. And there's a picture of Rudi as a young man, but Rudi Wobbe with his friend Jerry Burrellman to help him. So if you're interested in looking up more information about this, that's one book you should look into. It's a very well-written book. I didn't have anything to do with the writing of it, except I encouraged him to write it because he seemed in a bit of a hurry. I helped Karl begin to write his story. I interviewed him. I asked a friend of mine who was a professor of history at BYU to help me with the interviews. I was not a historian. I was a Germanist, a German studies story. And we did research. We did all the interviews. We met the former branch president who had also emigrated. And I'll tell you about him a little bit later. He was actually a very avid Nazi himself, which makes the story very interesting. We visited him. He refused to talk to us, but his wife let us into the house. Interesting encounter. Eventually, we published a small article in a journal called Sunstone Magazine. Those are the 3 boys. Helmuth's in the center. Karl's on his right, the taller. Rudi is on the left. He's the shorter of the 3 boys. So they were 3 friends. Die drei von der Tankstelle, as we would say in German. And this article was entitled, The Führer's New Clothes, Helmuth Hübener and the Mormons in the Third Reich. And it was very interesting. It was well received and was very interesting. I had a colleague named Tom Rogers, who was a good friend, and he was a bit of an aspiring playwright. He's a professor of Russian. And I gave him this material, and he wrote a play called Hübener Against the Reich. No, sorry, Hübener. Another person wrote a play later called Hübener Against the Reich, a man named David Anderson. I got the 2 confused. And that was quite a big success. It was played at BYU. Eventually, we brought out this book, The Price. It's a small book, The True Story of a Mormon Who Defied Hitler. It was a place called Bookcraft, which is now merged with Deseret Book. It's a very thin book because they kept saying, we know our readers, they don't want big, long books. You must keep it short. And we grudgingly threw out material. But when that was finished, Professor Tobler and I said, that's nuts. And we brought out another big book. And this one has got everything in it. And it was at the University of Illinois Press. It's called When Truth Was Treason, German Youth Against Hitler. By this time, I had switched helpers from Professor Douglas Tobler of the history department to Professor Blair Holmes of the history department. But this book has more information in it than all of the others, I think. It's more complete and it's fatter. So, and these are all available. I looked all these up beforehand, and they're most all of these available, either used or still new, on the internet, mainly at what's it called, Amazon. There is a new edition of that Truth Was Treason book, a paperback version that came out just last year. So it's still available. And this one's not quite as expensive as the old one was. This one has a different foreword. The foreword in the other one was by Klaus Hansen, who's a very important LDS historian at the University of Toronto. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of the the history of the information so that you can do more. At one point, Carl Schnibbes told me he wants to do a book in German. So we re-interviewed him. We got permission from the other publishers to reprint the story in German. And this one came out as Jugendliche gegen Hitler, die Helmuth Hübener Gruppe in Hamburg 41-42. There's a long story about this one because we found out only later that the publisher who wanted the book so badly wanted it because his parents had owned the publishing company before him, and it had published sort of Nazi stuff. And he wanted to turn up the page and wanted everybody to realize I'm not a Nazi publisher anymore. So this was very controversial, but I took the books away from him and gave them to LDS Books, and they sold them to LDS people in Germany. So they did survive, and there are lots of them around. So, and I'll just finally say one thing about, we then later did this little DVD. It's a 1-hour documentary film, quite well made. I assisted with it. And on this film, you will see Günter Grass, you will see Uli Sander, you will see me and Carl. Rudy had died by this time. And you will see others who are examining this case. So this is a really good one to look at, and it's still available. It's still being published, and I can't remember now who publishes it, but it's still available at. Can't think of the name, but you'll find it if you go online. In the meantime, Uli Sander, with my encouragement, brought out his book, his version of this story in German, called Jugendwiderstand im Krieg. So if you speak only German, you wouldn't be listening to me now, but this is one that you could give to somebody who only reads German. And Uli and I have become good friends, and he lives in Dortmund. So that's a little bit of background, but now let me tell you who Helmuth Hübener was. He was born in Hamburg. He was illegitimate. That doesn't seem to be very relevant, but it was. His mother remarried, had these two, his mother had the two older half brothers first, and then she got a divorce, and then she had Helmut illegitimately. I mentioned his illegitimacy only to show you that he was someone who had something to prove. He wanted to be a big deal, and he was smart, very smart. It was a legend about how smart he was. So when one of his brothers was in occupied France in what there was then called the Reichsarbeitsdienst, as a kind of a CCC corps for Americans, if you know what that was. He bought in France a little radio. It was the brand of the thing was Rolla, R-O-L-A, and it was a small little thing, but it was a very sophisticated little radio. It had a shortwave band and an AM and FM band, and it could pick up broadcasts from abroad. In Germany, this was illegal, and in fact was punished by capital punishment. You could die, you could be beheaded, you could be killed for listening to foreign broadcasts, because the Germans were very concerned that you would learn more than they wanted you to know. But his brother had brought this thing back from occupied France and had locked it in a cabinet in his grandparents' apartment in Hamburg, which is just around the corner from where Helmut lived. And then he was drafted into the army and sent to the front on the East Front to Russia. Helmut was having a dispute with his mother's newest husband, who was an avid Nazi, whose name was Hugo Hübener. And he was the guy who actually adopted Helmut, and that's why he has the name Hübener. Otherwise, Helmut was known as Helmut Gudat or Helmut Kunkel. His mother's maiden name was Gudat, and his brother's names were Kunkel. So the people in the ward, in the branch there, knew him as Kunkel or as Gudat, but nobody knew him as Hübener. But that's the name he's come down to us in history as. If you know any German, you'd be interested in knowing that there's a school in Hamburg named after him, and there's other places in Hamburg named after him as well. There's a Helmuth Hübener house downtown, which is a kind of meeting place for juveniles and for young people, which is a very interesting place. It's in a rough part of town. It serves as a kind of little Switzerland there in the middle of this war zone between gangs and other weird situations. But in this Helmuth Hübener house, they have adopted as their motto, Mut üben, which in German means always practice having courage. And it happens to be the central syllables of Helmuth, M-U-T, üben, Hübener. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, back to Helmut. So he went to live with his grandparents because he didn't like his stepfather, Hugo Hübener. He opened the cabinet where the radio was. He took it out. It didn't work. He got some vacuum tubes, had it fixed, plugged it in, turned it on, and he heard boom, 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 which are the first four notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, as you know. But it's also the V for victory symbol in Morse code. Ta, three shorts and a long. And V for victory, as you probably well known, was famous from Winston Churchill holding up his fingers in a V sign. And that was the sign that we Allies would be victorious. And it was the BBC of London, the British Broadcasting Company, sending broadcasting news in German. And so Helmut, who had learned in school to do sonography, shorthand, started taking down shorthand notes. He was an apprentice at the Hamburg municipal offices, the city of Hamburg offices, and he learned to type, which is quite unusual for a young man at that time. And it was quite unusual for him to do shorthand, but it was most unusual for him to have learned Morse code. He learned Morse code somehow, and that applies to this V for victory thing again. He was a very wide awake kid. And he happened to have the branch typewriter in his possession. It was a Remington. We have the serial number because the Gestapo confiscated it after he was arrested. The branch president, whose name was Arthur Zander, Z-A-N-D-E-R, had entrusted Helmut to be his personal secretary. And Helmut wrote letters to the soldiers who lived from the branch who were fighting in the army. So every week they would get a letter from the branch, typed by Helmut on this typewriter. But he had the typewriter, he had access to paper, he had access to the radio, to shorthand, and his grandparents went to bed early with the chickens, we were told. They went to bed with the chickens. So here he tuned in every night and he listened to the BBC. After a while, he invited Rudy, and then he separately invited Carl, and then he invited them both together to come and help him to listen to the BBC. Then he said, look, I'm going to make up some flyers on the typewriter, and you guys are going to help me, and we're going to distribute them all around Hamburg. We're going to put them in telephone booths. We're going to put them in mailboxes. We're going to do all kinds of creative things. We're going to put them on bulletin boards. We've got a stamp here that has a swastika on it, so it'll look like it's an official announcement, and they won't notice it on the bulletin board unless they stop to read it, and so forth and so on. And it scared the heck out of Carl because he was a little older. But he said, well, maybe we can make it work if each of us swear an oath that if the other ones are caught, if he's caught, then he doesn't rat out the other ones. And they thought, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So they said, okay. And being teenagers, they didn't think they could be caught anyway. So they started this thing, and it went for almost a year, a good part of a year, 9 or so months. And this was in 1941. Germany had just invaded the Soviet Union. They had destroyed Poland in 1939, and they had invaded. They were invading everywhere they could. They invaded Denmark. They invaded France, and now they had invaded the Soviet Union. And they thought, this Germany cannot be stopped. The greatest leader in the world, the greatest field marshal in the world, Adolf Hitler, is leading us. But right in the middle of that, people started seeing in their mailboxes and on their bulletin boards something that says, this war is dooming Germans to certain disaster. The Führer is a Verführer. He's a seducer, not a leader. He's a misleader, and he's a murderer, and he's a liar. So immediately these people started turning these into the Gestapo, the secret police. But for a whole 9 or 10 months, a good part of a year, of 1941, they got away with this, and Helmut wrote quite a number of these, and they're quite witty. They're quite intelligent. When the Gestapo saw them, they thought, oh, this is not some kid. This is a 30-year-old university professor who's writing these things. They couldn't believe it was a kid, in fact, when they found out. And a member of the branch presidency named Otto Berndt was hauled in by the Gestapo and interrogated for 3 days because they thought he was the guy behind Helmuth. This was all his idea, but he was completely innocent. The interesting thing happened when they let him go after 3 days. They walked him to the door. They fired questions at him right and left for 3 days. And he just answered the right way because he didn't know any different. And as he was going out, he said, "I hope you understand that you now know that I know nothing about this." They said, "Berndt, if we had even the slightest idea, the slightest suspicion that you knew anything about this, you wouldn't be leaving this place alive. But get this straight," they said, "Mr. Berndt, when we have this war behind us and we've wiped out all the Jews, you Mormons are next. We have no place in Germany for a sect, American sect like you." So that was kind of bone chilling. But Berndt survived, and he was one of the wonderful people that I interviewed. Some of the books behind me belong to Otto Berndt, because after he passed away, his son Otto Berndt Jr. gave me his father's library. Now, Helmuth worked down at a place called the Bieber House in Hamburg, which is the seat of the Hamburg city offices. And some of his fellow apprentices in the office, he talked to them. And one of them he talked to, Helmuth knew that this kid spoke French. So he said, "How would you like to translate something into French for me? Because there's a bunch of French prisoners of war working on the streets here in Hamburg, repairing streets. And I want to hand them something." And anyway, this got him in trouble because someone observed them talking, and the boy he talked to ratted him out, and he was arrested by the Gestapo. Another one of the apprentices there, a man named Gerhard Düver, was also arrested because in German there's a phrase called mitgefangen, mitgehangen. You get arrested, you get hanged, if you happen to be with the guy who gets arrested and hanged. And Gerhard, I don't think, did anything wrong, but he was with the three of them all through the prison system that they endured. Rudy and Karl were arrested a little while later. At first, Helmuth didn't say anything. We have all of the transcripts. We know exactly what was said and what was asked. And we know that Helmuth was tortured and was beaten. Eventually, he mentioned that his two friends had come to listen, but he said they were just friends, and I invited him. It was not entirely my doing. But they arrested him anyway, and they started to interrogate them. They started to beat them up and torture them. So eventually, they also were arrested, and all four of them were then transferred to Berlin. By this time, they were arrested in January of 1942. And they were interrogated and arrested and kept in prisons and harassed until August of 1942. So January to August, imagine what it was like. Young LDS kids living in jail cells, and they had a lot of people put in the cell with them to try to, as spies, to try to get more information out of them. They were finally taken to Berlin to what was called the Volksgerichtshof, which was kind of the Supreme Court of Nazi Germany. And it was known as a blood tribunal because almost nobody ever was not convicted. They just essentially killed everybody. Actually, Rudy and Gerhard and Karl were lucky that they weren't killed. Helmuth stood up and very bravely said, challenged the judges. When they said, "Do you have anything to say?" The other said no. And Helmuth said, I got something to say. He says, "Today you're condemning me to death for no reason. But you wait, your turn is coming." And he gave them a lecture on how Hitler Germany was doomed, which shows you how smart he was, but also how courageous he was. Then they were sent back to this labor camp in Hamburg called Glasmoor, and they witnessed from afar the firestorm after the bombing of Hamburg. And eventually they were sent out to a place called Graudenz, which is Grudentia in Poland, present-day Poland, where they worked in an underground aircraft factory that was producing Me-109 Messerschmitts from wrecked Messerschmitts. They took the Messerschmitts apart, put them back together, saved the parts that were usable. And that's where they then were when in January 1945, the Soviets broke through on the Eastern Front and came toward Poland And these guys had to walk through waist-deep snow in some cases back into Germany to be put in another labor camp. And while they were in that second labor camp, somebody came through the camp, a commission from the army, and they said, okay, Duver got 3 years, so he was almost ready to be released. They released him. Well, no, I'm sorry, they didn't until the British released him. But that was just a few weeks away. This was in April or May 1945. Karl Schnibbe, older, was a little more suspicious, and he had not said anything to these spies in his cell. They said, what are you in here for? He'd say, I was jaywalking. Rudy, on the other hand, was only 14, and he said, well, you know, we did this and that and the other. So Rudy got 10 years, Karl got 5. 3 years later, they said, okay, that's more than half of your thing. So you're in the German uniform now, Karl. You're a German soldier. He was immediately captured by Russians and sent off to what they called Siberia, which really wasn't Siberia. It was along the Volga in labor camps. So he survived another 5 years of labor camps. I'm sorry, 4 years of labor camps in Russia, whereas Rudy was released by the British forces in just a few weeks. And he went on a mission because he had promised the Lord that if he survived, he would serve a mission for sure. So Helmuth, meanwhile, was back in Berlin. There was a tearful scene where the other 3 were going back to Hamburg, and he was going to go to his death. They put him in a prison called, just outside of Berlin, called Plitzensee. And on October 27th, so this was August 12th, and he sat there in his cell, and there were various appeals. In fact, the Hitler Youth appealed to Hitler about this because they thought it would be bad for recruiting for young people if Hitler was killing young teenagers. But the appeals were all struck down, and on October 27th, at about I've forgotten the dates, the times now, but we have the document that tells us to the minute how this happened. I believe they came in at 9 in the morning. No, sorry, they came in at noon to his cell and said, you're going to be executed tonight after 8 o'clock. It just came back to me. And so he had time to write letters. He wrote one letter to his mother, one to his grandparents. Both of those letters burned up in the firestorm. And he wrote one to Maria Sommerfeld, who was a friend of the family, and a wonderful lady who had a big family, and everybody felt comfortable there, and all the kids hung out at her house. And it didn't hurt that her 2 daughters were attractive, and Helmuth's half-brothers were interested in those 2 girls. Werner Sommerfeld, a younger teenager in the family who knew Helmuth personally, but he was a few years younger, and still survives and lives in Salt Lake City and has become a very good friend of mine. And I see Werner very often. And he and I have talked to many, many firesides and given many approaches. And he is in the little video as well. And he's the one on the video who reads aloud the letter to Maria Sommerfeld, which was Helmuth Hübener's last letter. And it's a very touching letter. It's hard for me to even talk about it now without weeping. And it's impossible for Werner to do it. He weeps himself as he reads the letter. So you owe it to yourself to see that scene from the video at least. All right. After he'd written those letters, he was taken after 2000 hours, after 8 o'clock p.m. He was taken to the prison work tool shed, really. It sounds like a rickety old wooden building, but it isn't. It's a substantial stone building behind the prison. If you ever go to Berlin, you must try to take the opportunity to go to Plitzensee prison, which is now a memorial. It's still a prison. In fact, now it's a youth prison. And next to it, there's a school attached to it that's called the Helmuth Hübener School. And in the back of this place is the place where the guillotine stood in a room. And you'll see that guillotine, or you'll see a replica of it on this video if you can watch that. Because our film team got there and built up and put a replica in there, but they didn't get permission to. So the guys at the site were very upset when they went in and saw this had been set up there. That was a mistake, but never mind. He was brought into the room. We know this from some documents we found that actually showed how many seconds it took for them to bring him into the room, and how many seconds it took for the headsman to take his head off with the guillotine and to announce that the execution had been carried out. His grave is unknown. His body was given to the University of Berlin, the Anatomical Institute, for use as a cadaver by medical students. I once spoke to a friend of mine, the neighbor of a friend of mine in Berlin, who said he was a medical student exactly at that time. And he remembers being surprised and curious about why they were working on cadavers where the head was already severed, of young, healthy people. And he said, now I understand where those cadavers were coming from. Now, back in Hamburg, when the boys were first arrested, a guy named Jacobi supposedly stood up in the branch and said, well, if I'd known that he was fighting against the regime, I would have had a gun. I would have killed him. I would have shot him myself. There were some people in the branch who were very pro-Nazi. This comes as a shock to some Mormons. They think Mormons were, Mormons would not be Nazis. And by and large, they weren't. There was Helmuth, who was very courageous. The Schmidt family in Hamburg, the family of the future wife of Rudi Wobbe, Hertha Schmidt, they were all very much anti-Nazis. There were people in the ward, in the branch themselves, in the St. Georg branch, a guy named, oh my gosh, I'm blocking on his name right now. He made a negative comment about some Nazi statue, Heinrich Worps, sorry, forgot his name. And he was arrested and sent to a concentration camp and brutally tortured. When he came back to the branch, he only had a few weeks to live because they had physically actually broken him. But Helmut persisted. He said, no, I can't talk to it. Helmut persisted and drilled down and said, you must tell me what happened to you. So Heinrich Worps is a kind of hero. There was a woman named Emma Haase who brought a British leaflet that had been dropped out of a plane. She found it on her way to church. She brought it in and showed it to people. She said, what is this? And Arthur Sander said, snatched it away from her and said, don't bring that enemy propaganda in here. If you do, I'll send you to a concentration camp. There was one other wonderful young man named Solomon Schwartz, who was probably half Jewish. His mother had been inseminated by a wartime rape during World War I. It's a strange story, but it's true. She didn't know who the guy was, but she thought the guy who'd raped her was probably Jewish. So she named him Solomon. He looked kind of Jewish by the standards of the time, which the Nazis, of course, were pushing, these absurd caricatures of Jews. And so there was a sign that went up on the branch, a branch house that said, no Jews permitted to enter. And that had been put up by Sander to keep Solomon Schwartz out. But the Schmidts said, you come to our ward, you come to our branch. Now, he was later arrested and taken to a concentration camp where he died in Fuhlsbüttel. In Sachsenhausen, I guess it was. I forgot. At one of the concentration camps, he was killed. His sister, Anna Maria Feder, I later spent a long time with her. She was convinced that he was denounced by Arthur Sander. So you can see that this is powerful stuff. Imagine this happening in your branch. But on the other hand, if you've gone through the Trump era in the United States, you'll know that these kinds of things can happen in a ward. And people across the street will have a Trump sign. And people like me will have a sign that says, make America kind again. And then that sign will be stolen several times, but I'll keep putting it back because I'm a disciple of Helmuth Hübener and of Jesus Christ. Anyway, when he was finally then beheaded, he was excommunicated. Now, a lot of people of sort of anti-Mormon persuasion have said, aha, that proves that the church was pro-Nazi because they excommunicated him. It didn't happen like that at all. This Nazi enthusiast, the branch president, sat down and wrote excommunicated on his membership record. There was no kind of trial held. Nobody else had anything to do with it. Otto Berndt certainly would not have gone along with that. And after the war, when this was pointed out to the first presidency, a notation was placed on his permanent record in Salt Lake City, which I have seen with my own eyes, and we have pictures of it in our books, that says excommunication done by mistake, written across his membership record. Now, that reminds me that I want to talk about some anti-Mormons who've picked up this story, particularly this book, if you're familiar with it. Some people seem to be familiar with it. It's called Moroni and the Swastika, Mormonism in Nazi Germany by David Conley Nelson. David Nelson is a nice guy. I know him. I've known him since 2000. He wanted to be a PhD student. He brought a copy of my When Truth Was Treason book for me to autograph when I met him at the Mormon History Association meetings in Denmark in 2000, the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the first missionaries in Scandinavia, among whom was my fourth great grandfather, I'm very happy to say, who was also one of the translators of the German Book of Mormon, George Parker Dykes. So I autographed it to him, and I wrote in there, I hope you can expand the envelope of this story. And he worked hard for many years. He's a commercial airline pilot. He had time. He did research, and he did his dissertation at Texas A&M on this subject. And then he published it as his book with the University of Oklahoma Press. And it has a lot of important information in it. And it's a book that I recommend that everybody read. But it has a fatal flaw, in my view, which is that David Nelson, for some reason, he used to be a Mormon and he had a breakup with his wife, and who knows what anger is floating around his head. He thought that the church, he writes in here that the church was thoroughgoing Nazi church, and everybody in the church was a Nazi, and people like Helmuth Hübener was just a smokescreen. And I brought up Helmuth Hübener to try to hide the fact that the church is a thoroughgoing Nazi organization. So I rebut that. In fact, I have a long review essay if anybody's interested in seeing it. You can write me an email at akeele@gmail.com. Andreas, maybe you could put that up as a what do they call it at the top of the screen? akeele@gmail.com. I'd be happy to send it to you. I've already sent it to someone in Norway today. The point is that the Mormons in the Third Reich were a spectrum. There were some, and I don't think there were very many, but there were some who were very horrible. One of the guys that David Nelson dug up, I didn't know anything about him, was actually killing and torturing people in a kind of concentration camp in the basement of a building in Berlin. And it's an interesting story. It's a horrifying story. But David Nelson also found a guy that I didn't know about, who had been a branch president in Hanover, who was a very heroic guy, who saved a young Jewish couple on the night of broken glass, the Reichskristallnacht. He grabbed them from a bunch of Nazi tormentors, put them in his car, and drove them overnight to Switzerland to safety. So there are some people on both ends of the spectrum, heroic people. And so it's important for you to read this book, I think, but it's important for you to know that he biases his own argument. It's ironic. He points out, for instance, that a member of the first presidency of the church was anti-Semitic, and that's true. And there were lots of anti-Semites in the United States, especially this guy who was an older generation. He graduated from the University of Utah in 1898. And he says, oh, here's a member of the first presidency who's an anti-Semite. But David Nelson himself says that David O. McKay, who was also a member of the first presidency at that time, was a philo-Semite. He loved Jews. And David Nelson says, in his own words, this attitude was much more typical of the Mormons than the anti-Semitism. And yet in the same book, he goes on to argue that the Mormon church was a thoroughgoing pro-Nazi church. His own arguments don't add up. But what he has to say is so important that I want people to preserve the baby and throw out the bathwater. The bathwater are his arguments about the Mormons being pro-Nazi, which they weren't. There were some pro-Nazis, clearly there were. Just as today, there are some pro-Trumpers. And a lot of them, I'm told that something like 60% of Mormons in the United States, or maybe it was just in Utah, voted a couple of times for, I guess the first time for Donald Trump. The second time, no, it was the other way around. The first time they had Evan McMullen to vote for, so fewer voted for Trump. But the second time, I think something like 60% of them voted for Trump. So we are in actually much worse shape statistically than the Germans were in the Third Reich in terms of where the church stood on the political spectrum. I'd like you all to meet my dear wife.
He's met me.
Andreas has, but we're making this film for lots of people. They're going to see you.
Hi.
So you're now famous, baby.
Hello.
She's my loyal muse. Well, I'm going to try to finish up here in a couple of minutes. The implications for the Hübener story are very important. What did Helmuth do? First of all, he had a source of the truth in a time when truth was treason, as our title said. Today, the big argument is, what is truth? Donald Trump has this big lie that he won the election. And he calls the fact that Joe Biden won the election a big lie. He's a guy who's always saying that's fake news, but he's the biggest source of fake news. It's a strange kind of bizarre world that we live in. We live in a world where, believe it or not, QAnon has made inroads into Christianity. There's an article in the New York Times about how dangerous these QAnon things are and how gullible some evangelical Christians have been. And there are some Mormons who are gullible for this stuff. But if you look at the QAnon stuff, it's crazy talk. It's madness. Whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene saying that forest fires are caused by Jewish space lasers, or the other argument that the world is being controlled by shape-shifting alien space lizards who live in underground tunnels and are controlling the world. This stuff is batshit crazy, to use a technical medical term. And I apologize for that. But we must be able to get to the bottom of things. We must be able to get to the truth. And Helmuth knew how to do it. You have to have respectable sources. You can't have Rush Limbaugh. You must have something on the order of the BBC. These are people who are honest. The reason Helmuth knew that the BBC was true and the Nazi broadcasts were false was that the Nazi broadcasts were bombastic. Nobody ever got hurt on the German side. The British got all their ships sunk, and we never lost a single man. And that just can't happen in the real world. The British broadcasts were much more honest. They said, look, we lost a lot of people. We lost more people than the Germans did in this last battle. We lost more ships sunk in this last naval battle than the Germans did. And so this had a ring of truth. Psychologists will tell you that if the world is a complex place and you're frustrated by it, you might be tempted to glom onto a simplistic response, a simplistic answer, that this is all a big, vast conspiracy by baby-eating satanic Democrats who want to steal the election from Donald Trump. And if you're a person who likes simple answers, that might appeal to you. But we've got to work hard as church members and as individuals to make sure that we have truth. And then I think we have to follow Helmuth Hübener's example in being brave. Mut üben. Practice having courage. You've got to be brave enough to at least go out on your front lawn and put up a sign that says, "Make America kind again," even though the guy across the street has this enormous Trump sign, and not be deterred if it gets stolen during the night. And have the courage to call the police and say, "I'd like to report a stolen sign." You've got to at least do something. And as you can see, Linda and I are getting a little older. We have snow on the mountains. And we want anybody who's listening to us here to take up the challenge as the next generation to push the Hübener story for its implications and to be disciples of Jesus Christ, following the example of Helmuth Hübener and the others who are so brave. All of the other LDS people, in the essay which I volunteered to send out to you, I list all of these people, and I admire them because they were being hosed down by a fire hose of propaganda that the world has never seen. I mean, it makes Fox News look harmless to think what what the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels was pouring out on Germans. So it's a miracle that only a few people that we know of fell for that among the Mormons. And there were all kinds of reasons why the Mormons should have fallen for it. Hitler allowed us back into the genealogical archives. The other churches had kept us out for years. But now when you think about it, why was Hitler interested in genealogy? He wanted you to have to prove that your grandmother wasn't Jewish. So he let us into the archives. He got Germans back to work. There was huge unemployment, huge. There was hyperinflation. You couldn't buy a loaf of bread because you had to have a wheelbarrow full of trillion mark notes. And if you didn't go to arrive, then it would cost you 2 wheelbarrows full. So it was, clearly Hitler got people back to work. He started building the Autobahn. And very few people said, oh, he's building the Autobahn so we can have a 2-front war this time and run tanks back and forth. Nobody thought of that, because if your income is dependent on you not understanding something, you will not understand it. So we have to act as Hübener did. We have to marvel and learn from those good saints who didn't follow Hübener. And we have to work in whatever countries we are and whatever time we're in toward preventing those kinds of things or turning them back. I, in my wildest dreams, did not anticipate a Donald Trump, though I have been arguing since 1971 that we in America have to follow Helmuth Hübener's example and be more aware, be more wide awake, be better informed, be more responsible. Read the 98th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where it says we have to elect good, honest, and wise people, and we have to seek for them diligently. We can't be lazy, because when the wicked rule, the people mourn. And anything less than that comes from evil. So I'm through with my time. I think our time's gone. Andreas, I'm sorry. But I want you all to know, although I can't see any of you, that I would be happy to communicate with any of you at akeele@gmail.com. And I wish you well. And I wish all our respective countries well. And I hope that we are a light that cannot be hid under a bushel, not only in theological things, but in political things, because they're ethical and moral. And I advise you that in my last statement, listen carefully to the last several conferences from President Nelson and people like President Oakes and others who are warning us about constitutionality and taking the law into our own hands and listening to bogus sources of untruth. And I predict that you will hear more of this in the future. And if you look carefully in the last few years, you'll see a lot of it that you maybe didn't notice before. Thank you for your attention. And I wish you Godspeed and God bless.